to open it up to any questions that you might have before we get into the breakout session. Three lines of code, the most important. There should be a link to your source repository here for additional resources, right? Because what you don't want is for people to be reading the slides instead of always following you. And there's really only so much you can even cram, like code-wise, into a slide, right? So what I recommend is if you're going to do that kind of talk, do it a little bit more high level, maybe walk them through a couple demos, but then link it to a source repository where they can go and access it later. And that's actually a great way to connect with people and drive more people to your repository, to your brand, is to have those kinds of resources set up. But don't get too much into the minutia of it, because the other thing, if you put up code like that, people will be like, oh, there's like a semicolon missing. You know, it's just like, that's not the point of the talk, right? So that's why I say, like, even if you're going to put something like code snippets, really try to limit it, and instead give them access to the resource that's going to have more information. Yeah, so that's actually really why I loved unconferences. I mean, you have to give up your weekends, but usually it's only like hopefully one weekend. And I always did this thing where I was like in and out. I didn't like really stay and linger or network, because I would just have like 30 people that I talked to and then I was done. So yeah, I like to go to the conferences that I knew were on the weekends, whether they were unconferences or bigger conferences. And that way I didn't have to ask for time off, because sometimes bosses won't allow you to do that. But honestly, there is a great opportunity for managers to help spread the brand, recruit, if they let you take that time off. So I've actually coached a number of people to go up to their manager and be like, I don't want this to be counted as a day off. I want this to be counted as whatever else, as like a conference day or something like that. But some the nicer ones will let you do that. And then it's up to you to kind of pick the one that you think you're going to get the most exposure if you have to take that time off. The other thing I like to do, since you asked about time management, is don't wait till the last minute, right? So by that I mean you want to be like working towards a talk over some time, rather than, oh, it's next weekend, let me sit down and do all my slides, oh, and I have a release, oh, and I have these like 10 bugs to fix, right? You instead kind of want to backtrack, take a look at the conferences that are out there, figure out what you need to apply for. And a lot of times the call for papers is even 6 to 9 months in advance. So it's oftentimes like good to sit down, do the proposal, in a Google Doc, 6 months in advance, submit it, and then hopefully once you get accepted, 3 to 6 months after, then at that 3-month mark is really a good time where you're really just spending maybe an hour to 2 hours a week on it. And if you can do that over a 3-month period, then you can spread it out and manage your time better, rather than saving it all until the end. The stuff that I like to do at the very end is just practice work. The kind of first month is nailing down the mechanics of it, and then the second month is like the slides and all of that stuff. But yeah, if you can kind of spread it out, treat it just like you would a regular project at work, right? Treat it as like your 20% time, and that will oftentimes help. And the other is when it comes to figuring out time management, this is where I oftentimes like to do some crowdsourcing, right? So before I end up spending too much time, I'll just float an outline by people, right, to see where they might have some holes, rather than going completely off base and then be like, oh, I have to redo all this again. I don't think I've ever frozen. I've definitely tripped over my words multiple times. But it's, I guess it's one of these things where, in your head before you get up there, you have to tell yourself, it's not about perfection, it's about getting through it. It's kind of that actor's mentality, like the show must go on, right? Doesn't matter if you deliver it perfectly or whatever, or you stutter, or you stumble, or you say the wrong word. You just have to get the words out there. And so I often am like, I'm not looking for perfection, I just want to communicate this to somebody, pretend like I'm having a conversation, right? The other thing, if you want to avoid getting into that mindset of freezing, never write a script. right? This is where people get tripped up. They have a script in their head that they're running through and they've memorized, and they get on that stage, they see the bright lights, or they see people that they don't know, or whatever, and they freeze and they forget that script. So what I advocate, and I realize I didn't talk about it here, is actually taking some improv classes or even doing some improv. So nowadays, like, I don't write a script, I do an outline, and then I get up, and the first time I run through it, it's just bleh, right? But that's okay, I can kind of refine it over time. And then what that lets me to do is when I get up there, I haven't memorized anything, so it's kind of like shooting from the hip, and it's okay. I've got a structure, I kind of know what the high level is, and I'm thinking more about that, and I use the slides kind of as a cue, but nothing more, right? And that helps get over that frozen moment. But yeah, if you go down the path of a script, I've seen a lot of people, even I've had this experience where I had a script and I just froze. And so when I put it away and I just talk about what I know and the experience I've had, one, it's better to engage, and two, I come off a lot more casually. I don't know if you've done that, or
that's right.
Yeah, do you use a script, or?
I have done both.
Okay.
But I agree with you
Yeah.
that the sort of just prompting by the slides and being yourself is probably more desirable.
Yeah, and a lot of times, you know, what I coach people on is like, just kind of sit down and have a conversation. Like, tell me what it is that you recently worked on, and then when you stand up, it should be kind of the same. That was something that I had to actually practice a while back, because I have this tendency of presenting like a lecturer rather than like a human. So I had to kind of learn to be a little bit more personable, and it took, like, a friend of mine said, you know, it should really just be you speaking to me, and that's it. Like, and then multiply me times 50 or 5,000 people, right? It's no different. And that kind of started to sink in and bring it down to a more human level, but I felt like I had to somehow be, I don't know, more like a presenter or a performer, and that would also sometimes get me to freeze. So yeah, think about it more as just like talking to somebody. And as I've done teaching to like college students, that's helped, because you can't, like, those guys see right through you, right? And they're so casual. They're like sitting in the back room eating pizza, and you can't do anything but like laugh at them. So yeah. So you know why I go out there and like talk to everybody before the forum? It's so that I make friends. And that way when I look out, you know, to the audience, I'm like, oh, yeah, I remember having that conversation with you 5 minutes ago. Or like, yeah, Rose, she was in my class a few months ago, right? So it kind of gives a familiar face, and then like the nervousness goes down as long as there's somebody I can look at. And hopefully, you know, they're not looking at you like, what are you doing, right? So never look at your mom in the audience unless your mom isn't, you know, strict. But yeah, so you got to be careful about who you look at. But yeah, that's oftentimes helpful. I always try to make it a point to connect with at least 2 to 3 people before the talk starts, just so that I have the chance to like look at them and see if they're still engaged. That helps. So it depends on like what tier, right? Obviously we want to kind of start with like a few $100s, or, you know, travel assistance. But once you start moving up into like 1,000, 5, 10,000, that sort of stuff, you have to be careful, right? So some organizations, you should always ask, right? You should first ask by saying, you know, do you have a budget for speakers, right? Because if they're like, oh no, we don't, then you could say, okay, well, you know, I would like to be paid, so if you don't have a budget, then I might not be a good fit. That's not a no-go, right? A lot of times that's, okay, let me go and like find out if there's some way of creating a budget. And a lot of times people will go and do that just because they hadn't thought about it, right? So that's kind of the first. The second is, if it is a conference where they're selling tickets, go look at the ticket price, right? Look at the ticket price, and then talk to the organizer and be like, how many people are going to be there? Right? And then I think it's safe to say asking for anywhere from 1 to 10%, depending on if you're the keynote speaker versus like somebody that's doing a workshop or something like that. It's fair to ask for that, right? So that's kind of how you can reverse engineer it to create an anchor, because yeah, a lot of times they won't come up with a number. It's not like a job where they're like, this is market rate, right? A lot of times they'll be like, well, how much do you want to be paid, right? So then you've got to kind of do the reverse engineering. A lot of times people will say, though, that we kind of have like a fixed fee that we're paying our speakers, and then we'll cover the rest with lodging and travel assistance and stuff like that. But yeah, I think it's safe to ask for minimum 1,000. A lot of places, especially if it's like a big corporation where you're coming in and you're essentially doing some consulting in your talk, it's safe to go up to like $5,000 to $7,000. Especially if it's something where you're going to be taking a substantial amount of your time to prepare, right? My golden rule is like the number of hours that I put into this multiplied by my hourly rate should be how much I charge to some of those bigger companies that I'm coming in to speak in. So that's another way to think about it. And that's actually an easier way to convince them, right? Because they'll be like, why should I pay you? And you're like, well, this is my hourly rate, and this is how long it would take me to prepare a presentation that's going to be of high enough quality for your employees or your audience. So that's why I would like this, right? So giving some justification around it. Because sometimes it'll be like, $10,000, that's like insane. And then you're like, wait a second, like how many people are going to be there? Right? And what are they going to want in terms of takeaways? And like, you obviously want me to do a good job coming in and presenting, so you can think about it that way as well. Does that help? Give you some idea? Yeah. Yeah, when you move into like the 30, 50, 100K, like I said, you got to have like a New York Times bestseller, you have to be a celebrity or stuff like that. So when I crack that nut, I'll do another talk on it. But until then, yeah. It's really a personal choice, right? So like this particular talk that I'm doing, I rehearsed this once yesterday, and then like kind of this morning just a little bit in my head. I didn't actually speak it out because I wanted to preserve my voice. But if you're just getting started, right, I actually tell people to over-prepare a little bit, right? And by that I mean, maybe 3 to 5 times is what you do. But remember what I said, it's got to be in different settings. So don't do like 5 times by yourself, right? It should be like 1 or 2 times by yourself, maybe the beginning and ending, like the 1st and the 5th, and then kind of the middle time should be with other people. And everybody says different things about this. Some people say don't practice the day of, some people say do practice the day of. It's up to you. Once again, you don't want to get into too much practice where you've memorized it, right? You got to be careful of that. But I would say for your first 2 times, over-preparation can be a good thing. The thing, though, is you don't want to over-prepare to where you become a robot, right? And you're just like saying exactly what it is that you had delivered. So that's why I say improving is also a good thing. Unfortunately, the lights were so bright. That was one of the reasons I was nervous, is because I couldn't see the audience. Like I was looking for like Justin in the audience. I couldn't see him. I was looking for my boyfriend. I couldn't see him. And so I was like, I can't see any familiar faces. So the lights were really bright. And even though I went to the dress rehearsal the day before, the lights weren't as bright then. So that kind of threw me off a little bit. But it's just a black stage. They don't like actually black anything out. Yeah. Yeah.